Good evening. I'm Mike Stiles, and I serve as the chair of the Committee of 70 Board of Directors. After a pretty interesting career as a city prosecutor, judge, U.S. attorney, and at the Phillies, it's now my privilege to serve in this role at 70 at an interesting time as well. I believe deeply in the Committee of 70's mission of promoting representative, ethical, and effective government. I don't think in 70's entire 116-year history that our mission has ever been more important than right here and right now. In 2020, our nation has faced significant, unprecedented challenges. We've seen the devastating effect of a public health crisis, an unpredictable recession, and tragedies sparking a nationwide reckoning with a centuries-old plague of racism. Throughout this, we are preparing for an election unlike any we have ever seen. But I have faith in our institutions and in our citizens. I have confidence that with the help of the important work of the Committee of 70 and many, many others, we will overcome these challenges. Our democracy will endure. We appreciate all of you joining us tonight for this special event at this unique time. Thanks to our many generous sponsors and supporters. Your commitment to our work has made this event possible and sustains the Committee of 70. I'd particularly like to thank Brandywine Realty Trust, our presenting sponsor, for their leadership and great commitment to our cause. Please enjoy this innovative and groundbreaking program we call 70 Minutes Election 2020, what to expect, what it means, and where we go from here. Thanks again. It's now my pleasure to introduce David Thornburg, President and CEO of the Committee of 70.
Thank you, Mike, and let me add my welcome as well. In normal times, I'd be asking you now to take your seats at our annual luncheon and introducing you to one of the terrific speakers we've had in recent years. Folks like Vice President Biden, historian John Meacham, or presidential hopefuls John Kasich and John Hickenlooper. But of course, these are not normal times, and I don't need to use the word unprecedented to tell you why. The good news is that this organization knows how to pivot. We've done it before when a few years ago, our speaker, a guy named Chris Christie, called us up the night before our luncheon to let us know that he wasn't feeling well and couldn't make it. We scrambled, our sponsors stuck with us, and thanks to our resilience, we managed through the crisis. We had a little more time this time to execute our pivot, and I'm really excited about the concept we came up with. In a minute, we'll introduce you to the premiere of 70 Minutes, Election 2020 edition. 2 weeks away from the end of this election, we've assembled an all-star lineup of national commentators, pollsters, and pundits. Folks like Michael Smerconish, historian Michael Beschloss, Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project, and political journalist Emily Bazelon, to give us all their take on the what, so what, and now what of this momentous presidential election. With the help of producer Scott Merkin and his team, we're presenting all of this virtually, coming to you in the comfort of your own home. Sit back and enjoy.
Welcome to 70 Minutes, Election 2020, presented by the Committee of 70. Tonight we hear from Michael Smerconish, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Michael Beschloss, Asma Khalid, Nate Gonzalez, Emily Bazelon, Charlie Dent, David Frum, Chuck Rosenberg, and Amber McReynolds as we discuss what to expect, what it means, and where we go from here. Thank you to our committed sponsors for their continued support to make this event possible.
Hi, I'm Governor Tom Wolf, and I'm proud to join you at this Committee of 70 virtual event. We're just over 2 weeks away from Election Day, and I want to thank all the election officials and advocates for their incredible work to prepare for it. Voting during a pandemic will be different for all of us, but I want all Pennsylvanians to know that our state is prepared and that voting is safe, secure, and easy. At this point, many of our friends and neighbors have already returned their ballots thanks to the new option to vote by mail. I was proud to sign that bill into law last year to allow people to vote from the comfort of their own homes, and the pandemic has made it even more important. Pennsylvania is also ready if voters prefer to vote in person at their polling place on November 3rd. We've invested millions of dollars in new voting systems with a paper trail, and the state is helping counties to have the masks, hand sanitizers, and other tools to keep people safe from the virus. A record number of votes is expected to be cast in this election, and counting all of those ballots may not be complete on Election Day. Counties are preparing with high-speed scanners and other equipment, but we must remember that it is more important for results to be accurate than fast. Finally, I want to thank all of you for your efforts to ensure this is a fair election and that every eligible voter can cast a ballot, that their vote is counted, and that that count stands. That is truly the foundation of our democracy.
This December, I'll celebrate my 6th anniversary as president and CEO of the Committee of 70. Little did I know in 2014 how consequential this election would be and how it would reveal the distinctive value of the Committee of 70 and the enormous contribution we make to strengthening our local democracy. We Pennsylvanians don't realize it, but there aren't many organizations like ours in this country. A nonpartisan good government organization founded 116 years ago and still led by a group of prominent business and civic leaders. In our youth, the Committee of 70 actually recruited and endorsed our own slate of local candidates. For a variety of reasons, we ended that practice, choosing instead to endorse not people, but a set of values and principles. We push back on political corruption. We promote integrity, transparency, and accountability in government. And most important, we believe that every eligible voter and their vote should count in every election and that every candidate will respect the will of those voters. That theme, let's call it #MakeMyVoteCount, runs through all of the issues we've tackled the last few years. In normal times at this point, I'd highlight the great work we've done to push back on partisan gerrymandering. Draw the Lines PA is an initiative we founded 4 years ago with the help of some great Pennsylvania foundations. The concept of Draw the Lines is simple. Put the digital pen in the hands of the people. Let them draw their own election maps and demonstrate publicly that they're ready, willing, and able to participate in this core process of designing democracy. As of this fall, more than 6,000 citizens from age 12 to Social Security eligible have taken us up on the offer. It's the largest outpouring of hands-on citizen mapping in the history of this country. As we approach the formal process for drawing congressional, legislative, and city council maps next spring, those who control the pen can be sure they'll hear from the members of our Citizen Map Corps to guarantee that the maps drawn belong to those who are represented, not to those who are temporarily elected to represent them. Again, if these were normal times, now I tell you about our efforts to squash another pernicious bug in the operating system of Pennsylvania's democracy, one that also contributes to political gridlock. Every year, Pennsylvania's closed primary system shuts out over 1 million tax-paying voters from voting in primary elections simply because they choose not to register as either a Republican or Democrat. Since low turnout primary elections are almost always the most important election in deciding who wins, locking out independent voters not only deprives them of an important right, but also encourages those who are elected to ignore them. In response, we've organized and helped lead a new statewide coalition called Open Primaries PA. This past year, we supported Senator Joe Scarnati's bill to open up primary elections to unaffiliated voters, a bill that passed the Senate by a vote of 42-8. While a similar House bill sponsored by Republican Representative Chris Quinn from Delaware County failed to gain support, rest assured that 70 and the Open Primaries Coalition will be back in 2021 to make sure that all eligible voters can cast their vote in every election. But these are not normal times. This is 2020, and our democracy is being tested like never before from the top down. I think we all know the particulars, but just to set the stage, we're in the midst of a pandemic that sickened 8 million people, cost 220,000 their lives, and left millions jobless. Our politics at all levels have become even more corrosive and hyper-partisan. Our democracy is threatened by disinformation campaigns mounted by foreign actors and, incredibly, our current president that irresponsibly shake voters' faith in the democratic process. Thousands of Americans have joined to protest the stain of institutional racism and a criminal justice system that too often fails to uphold our ideals of justice for all. And if that were not enough, here in Pennsylvania, we find ourselves as perhaps the most sought-after prize in the presidential campaign. In this election, Thanks to bipartisan legislation passed last fall, our 9 million registered voters have important new voting options, including the chance to vote by mail without the need for an excuse. Spurred by concerns about the pandemic, now millions of Pennsylvania voters, 10 times more than ever before, will be voting by mail for the first time. This challenges all of us to make sure voters get it right, that their vote counts, and it also challenges our local officials to run 2 parallel voting operations, one in person and one by mail at the same time. There's never been a more anxiety-producing, exhausting election. In the face of these challenges, the Committee of 70 falls back on the advice embraced by Teddy Roosevelt. Do what you can, with what you have, where you are. We have poured ourselves into the job of engaging and educating voters, for ensuring safe and sure elections, and into the job of supporting our local election officials. Responsibility for this historic moment in our democracy belongs to all of us, not just them. Our We Vote voter education and outreach initiative has been joined by over 100 partners, major employers like Independence Blue Cross, Brandywine Realty Trust, PICO, and Children's Hospital, community partners like AARP, our great colleges and universities, the Free Library, the Urban League, and Enon Tabernacle Baptist Church, and media organizations like KYW, 6ABC, and WHYY. Together, we've reached over 1 million voters with trusted, nonpartisan information about elections and voting in Pennsylvania. We've also dedicated enormous time and energy to support our local election officials to make sure they have what it takes to run a free, fair, accurate, transparent election in this challenging time. All of us want to be able to stand tall when the dust settles from this election, to know that we've left everything on the field to safeguard a democratic process that we can be proud of. We've helped identify best practices and best practitioners from around the country, particularly in the area of voting by mail, and connected them to our local officials. We've helped recruit poll workers, the first responders of democracy, and make sure they're connected to the training and knowledge they need to do their jobs. When the Committee of 70 was founded in 1904, one of our principal aims was to protect the voting process. That meant something different then than it does now, but the need is more urgent. As this election approaches, and as we prepare for election week, it's critical that all of us stand tall in our defense of our local democracy. We will not tolerate voter intimidation or the threat of violence. We will not tolerate any partisan disruption of the process. We will condemn anyone who spreads disinformation. We will do everything we can to make sure that every voter votes and every vote counts. We all have a job to do as Philadelphians, Pennsylvanians, and Americans to see to it that good things happen in Philadelphia around this election. We must all be champions of our local democracy at a time when our democracy, at all levels, needs women and men of goodwill, integrity, and influence to stand in its support. We're so grateful for our terrific chair, Mike Stiles, and our board who guide us and support us. We're so grateful for those of you who also share in and support our mission. Finally, I'm so grateful for and proud of our staff and partners. We could not ask for more hardworking, capable, and committed champions than Lauren Christella, Pat Christmas, Dan Bright, Paul Drosch, Justin Villery, Chris Sotullo, and Ashley Session. Thank you to them, and thank you as well.
First and foremost, the vote by mail process is tried and true. It's been used in all of the 50 states for years. It dates back to the Civil War. And part of the reason that it was set up at that time is to solve logistical challenges that soldiers were facing from being able to vote in the presidential election. And so it's a process that's been around and been in existence for a long period of time. States across the country, all of the 50 states have a vote by mail program. And many of the states have had an extensive vote by mail program, including many states where the majority of their ballots have been vote by mail ballots for many years. That actually isn't a new phenomenon either. So it is a trusted process. It provides convenience, it provides safety, it provides access. So voters can trust this process. And what's really important for voters to understand is that they can rely on their local elected election officials for the most accurate and up-to-date information about how to vote by mail or how to vote in person. And they also need to pay close attention to the rules within each state, as well as the instructions for how to return the ballot in a safe and secure way that works for them. So it's up to voters. Voters get to decide which method of voting they choose. And I would encourage voters to look at all their options and decide what works best for them.
The election has not happened yet, so we must be very circumspect about what we say about it. But most projections are for a substantial Republican defeat, not only at the presidential level, but up and down the ticket as well. I've been involved in Republican and conservative politics my whole life. I knocked on doors for Ronald Reagan in 1980 as a student. I worked in the administration of George W. Bush. And I think the Republican Party has made some really important contributions to the history of the United States, to the public good. What has happened under President Trump has just, it's wounded me. I feel ashamed all the time. It's hard for me to look my children in the face and to talk to them about my lifetime's political work. I hope we can put this party back on its feet as something that contributes usefully to the America of the future, that has an open door to everybody. Not everyone should be a Republican. It's a two-party system. If you're getting 98% of the vote, that's not a democracy. 50% plus a little bit more is all anybody should be aiming to get. But the 50% or a little bit more that you're aiming to get, that should be open to people of all races and all backgrounds. It should be open to men and to women, to people of all lifestyles, to people of all orientations. And we should be encouraging everyone to participate. If your plan for building your majorities to stop some parts of the country from voting, then you have a bad plan. We need plans for building majorities that assume everyone is going to vote, or everyone who wants to is going to be able to vote anyway. Where do we go post-Trump? I think we try to build a new kind of Republican Party that is economically inclusive, that is culturally modern, and that's environmentally responsible.
Hi, I'm Michael Smirkanish. Today we're going to discuss what to expect on election night, where the race stands now, as well as concerns about how the election will take place, polling data, and the possibility of litigation. We're happy to be joined by Emily Bazelon and Nate Gonzalez. Emily is a writer for the New York Times Magazine, a senior research fellow at Yale Law School, and co-host of Slate's political Gabfest. She's been a guest on The Colbert Report and NPR's All Things Considered, while her work has appeared in The Atlantic and Washington Post. Nate is the editor and publisher of Inside Elections, a CNN political analyst, and an elections analyst for Roll Call. He's appeared on Meet the Press and is a former associate producer for CNN's Capitol Gang. Thank you to Nate and to Emily for joining us.
I don't think it's that likely that the Supreme Court will decide the November election. I say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, if it's not a close election, then the chance that it will end in any kind of lawsuit is much lower. And the second reason I don't think it's likely that the Supreme Court will play a definitive role is that that was such a divisive event for the country when it happened in 2000 during the Bush versus Gore lawsuit. And I think the Supreme Court will be reluctant to insert itself into the outcome of this election in the same way. It could happen. I don't mean the slightest to take it off the table as a possibility, but I think there are a lot of reasons why the justices would be worried about the consequences for their own institution, for the Supreme Court, as well as for the country. It is possible that a new conservative majority would not really be swayed by that reluctance, but I think there are institutional reasons why the court would be much better off staying out of the election results. And even if the election is litigated, it is possible to leave the outcome to state courts to decide. If an election dispute reaches the Supreme Court, unfortunately what we have seen in the cases that have led up to the election is that we have seen kind of typical partisan splits where the conservative majority justices appointed by Republicans have been narrowing voting rights. And then liberal Supreme Court justices appointed by Democrats have wanted to widen them. So we've seen that, for instance, in a lawsuit about the Wisconsin primary, which was about whether to extend the deadlines for returning mail-in ballots that the state was just having trouble processing and needed more time for. And we saw conservatives really cut off that additional expansion of time. And then in a recent case out of South Carolina, similarly, the conservatives on the court wanted to reinstate a requirement for a witness signature, even though lower courts had said, given the exigencies of the coronavirus, it really wasn't necessary to have that same witness signature requirement. Just given the importance of making sure that people are able to vote safely by mail if that's how they need to vote. So I think, unfortunately, thus far, we have seen some partisan appearing splits on the Supreme Court. And that is not helpful for our democracy, to see the justices appear to divide along party lines in suits that really should just be about running the election as fairly and equally for everyone as possible. I think on election night, we may need to be patient with Pennsylvania. The whole country may need to be patient. And the reason for that is that in Pennsylvania, election officials cannot begin tabulating the results until the day of the election. And I mean tabulating the results for all of the mail-in ballots that the election officials in the counties will have in advance. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin are the only two swing states where the election officials can't do a lot of advance counting. And that is a kind of quirk of state law, which will have a lot of impact for determining how quickly we know the results in Pennsylvania if those results are close. So I think it's going to be important to kind of take a deep breath, let the election officials do their work, and understand that it's because of this quirk of state law and not through their own fault that it's taking them longer. I'm concerned about a few states like Texas, for example, and Georgia, where there have been moves by either election officials or the courts to narrow access to voting. So we've seen court decisions in Texas, fueled by the governor, that would reduce the number of secure drop-off boxes for ballots to 1 per county. That's probably not enough. There are big, huge counties in Texas. That would mean people would have to drive a long way to drop off their ballots. And there are reasons that people are worried about sending ballots back through the mail, particularly at the last minute. So that kind of reducing access to voting safely for people who want to do it absentee is something I think we should all be worried about as citizens and residents of the United States. The more people participate in our democracy, the stronger our democracy is. And I'm also concerned about reports of very long lines from people who want to vote early in states like Georgia. People should not have to stand for hours in line to cast a ballot in the United States of America in 2020. That's just not a fair burden to put on people. And I have a lot of admiration for people who are taking the time to do that, but it's not fair to expect people to give that much of their day away because election officials are unprepared for the large number of voters who care enough this time to show up and cast their ballot. I do think the turnout for this November election is likely to be higher than in 2016. And, that is because politics has become part of the daily diet for so many of us. Whether it's because of the coronavirus or the police protests over the summer or for some other reason, I think a lot of Americans more than ever are experiencing how important the functioning of our government is to our daily lives. And people care a lot on both sides about what's going to happen and feel like they have a stake in making sure that they are part of choosing the next leaders of the United States in Congress, in state and local races, as well as the presidency. So I think there is just a lot of attention and interest this year. The epidemic of the coronavirus in particular is teaching us what we can and should be able to rely on from the government and what it means when the government doesn't come through for us. So for all those reasons, I do expect higher turnout in this election than in 2016. I certainly think it's a possibility that there could be a lot of litigation if the election is close in battleground states. I mean, look, if it's close, both sides will want to make sure that the results are what they appear to be. And you want to make sure that the count really reflects the will of the people. So there is a degree to which it is healthy to inspect ballots and make sure that they are being fairly processed and tabulated and counted. The problem with drawn out litigation is that you can, in theory, put in jeopardy a state's ability to file its slate of electors in time to be counted on December 8th or later in December in order to have the proper measures for choosing the president that are in our laws. And you don't want an election, especially a hugely divisive presidential election, decided in the courts. The courts are not our elected branch of government, and a presidential election, as much as possible, should reflect the will of the people, the voters. And so if we have to send those votes to be counted and haggled over in court by judges, that is going to, I think, shake people's confidence that they got to choose the president, they got to choose their senators and their congresspeople and their elected state and local representatives. So I think it's a possibility this could wind up in the courts, but I really hope that that does not happen for the sake of our democracy.
Well, I'm not sure anyone is predicting precisely who is going to win, but I will say that Joe Biden has the advantage in this presidential race. In our current ratings, we have Biden with the advantage with 319 electoral votes when only 270 are needed to win. The easiest thing to do would be to say that the presidential race is a toss-up to make sure that my projections aren't wrong. But that would be, I think, disingenuous, a disservice to you all, and also ignoring the preponderance of data which show that Biden has the advantage in this race. Polling in the 2016 election has been a constant talk for the last 3.5 years. It's true that Hillary Clinton had the advantage in both the national and battleground state polls 4 years ago, and Biden has the advantage in both the national and battleground state polls this year. But I think when you dig a little bit deeper, there are some big differences. First of all, at the national level, where Hillary Clinton was ahead by about 3 or 4 points, Biden is routinely at about 8, 9, or 10 points. And we know from 2016 that we don't have a national election in this country, but it is an indication of the overall political environment. Now, specifically in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, in each of those, Hillary Clinton had between a 3 and 6 point advantage. Biden has an advantage up to 8 points in those states. So even if there was a similar margin or a similar miss on polling, then Joe Biden, I think, would still carry most of those states. On a little bit different level, I'm encouraged that we have more data this time. I went back and looked at how many pollsters were polling Michigan and Pennsylvania, or specifically Michigan and Wisconsin. And you basically, in the final weeks of the campaign, and you basically had 6 pollsters that were polling there. Now, fast forward to today, where there are more pollsters who are focused on the state races rather than the national race, and you have a dozen pollsters. And so that gives me a little bit more confidence about projecting Biden with the advantage, because we have more data points, more people with their methodologies factoring into these averages and generally pointing in the same direction. Secret, shy, or hidden Trump voters is a topic of conversation that we've been having for 4 years. I'm open-minded enough to believe that it could happen again. But when I talk to Republican pollsters, they are skeptical about it being a large number of people, and that it is large enough to overcome the deficits that we're seeing the president facing in key states right now. Some of those Republican pollsters admit it could be 1% or 2%, but when we're talking about gaps of 4, 5, 6, or 8 points in key states, that's just not enough to get the job done. On a qualitative side, I'm not sure how many of those shy, hidden Trump voters are shy anymore. It might not have been socially acceptable 4 years ago, but now that he's been president, I think a lot of his supporters are happy with the way that he has performed in office, and they're grateful for the judges and the 3 Supreme Court justices, and they're not as shy as what they were I'll go even as far to say that we might be underestimating the visceral reaction from Democratic voters, that Democrats 4 years ago took the race for granted. They didn't think Trump could win. Now that he's been in office for almost 4 years, they are determined to not let that happen again, and to not let President Trump have a second term. So we might actually be underestimating some of that Democratic fervor. In the fight for the Senate, Democrats are most likely to gain control of the United States Senate. They need a net gain of 4 seats to get to the majority, but they can control the Senate by gaining 3 seats and winning the White House, because then Vice President Kamala Harris could break any 50-50 ties. Right now, our current projection in the Senate is that Democrats gain between 4 and 6 seats. And so that would be enough, even if they don't win the White House, even though it looks like Biden has the advantage. The key states, I think the key states to watch would be North Carolina and Iowa, even Georgia, where both Senate seats are on the ballot. In each of those cases, it's somewhat of a similar story, that President Trump won all of those states fairly handily in 2016, but he is struggling to win them again. Not only are the races closer, but in some cases, like North Carolina, Biden looks like he has the edge. And so that is dragging these Senate races into a more competitive category. We have to remember that there's a strong correlation between Senate results and the presidential results. That 4 years ago, every single state voted for the same party for president as it did for the Senate. I think there's just less and less of an appetite for ticket splitting. Well, I'll let you know in a couple of weeks whether the polls were accurate in gauging Trump and Biden support. The confidence that I have in at least projecting that Biden has the advantage is based on the larger number of data points. Whereas we have almost twice as many pollsters looking at the key battleground states as what we did in 2016, and hopefully that is key in identifying the trend. When looking ahead, I think it's important not to just look at any one single poll. It's to try to look at as many polls as possible and identify the trend. So that's why I'm not a pollster myself, but I digest as many polls as possible. I want to see as many public polls, private polls, partisan polls, nonpartisan polls. I want to see it all, because I want to put it all together and try to get a complete picture.
Hi, I'm Jerry Sweeney, President and CEO of Brandywine Realty Trust, and I'm pleased to join you tonight. It's been said many times before, but it bears repeating. We are truly living through unprecedented times. A once-in-a-lifetime global pandemic, a nationwide economic shutdown and reopening, a societal reckoning with racial justice in our streets and in our institutions, and an election so contentious that it calls into question the very ideals of our democracy. In Philadelphia, we have faced a litany of challenges before the pandemic, which have now been exacerbated by the perfect storm of economic uncertainty, a public health crisis, and a need to re-examine both who we are and where we want to go. And although we know that many more difficult days lie ahead, we take great comfort in the ways our community has come together. Philadelphia has always been a city that rallies to take care of its own, and we are fortunate to have the civic and community organizations that we do, who are rising to new challenges every day with grace and with grit. Now more than ever, the Committee of 70's mission is critical. They advocate for good governance, transparent public policy, and disciplined allocation of public resources. They drive a pro-job growth agenda designed to address our city's high rate of poverty and lean headfirst into the economic and social inequities that plague our world. Brandywine has long been a supporter of the Committee of 70, not just for its mission, but because we share similar values. Now, as we chart the path forward, city leaders must be bold in enacting broad-based solutions that are more equitable and just. And as a developer, we feel a deep responsibility to contribute. From creating paths to family-sustaining jobs, to making low-cost capital available to small and minority-owned businesses, to funding affordable housing, community capacity building, and educational support. We are building an economy that serves all Philadelphians and creates durable value for future generations. At Brandywine, we try to see challenges as opportunities, and this is certainly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We applaud the Committee of 70's advocacy to make the Philadelphia of tomorrow even better than the Philadelphia of today. And I know that together, through civic engagement, private sector leadership, community support, and a bold vision for the future, we can realize all of our aspirations for Philadelphia to become a global leader and to finally recognize the city's full potential.
I've learned so much about my homeland, about my country, in covering multiple presidential election cycles. You know, I'm from the Midwest originally. I'm from a very actually small town in Indiana. And during the 2016 election cycle, you know, I've written about this actually after that election was over, how challenging it was on a very personal level, because you know, there was a lot of what I would call inflammatory rhetoric, to be frank, at times directed towards Muslims, towards people of color. And yet during that election cycle, my job was a beat that was focused on demographics and politics. It was focused on voters. And that meant that I interviewed a cross-section of people, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, all sorts of people. And really, I had one mission in mind, which was to better understand why people felt a certain way and why they were supporting a particular candidate. But 2016 was challenging, you know, if I'm honest, because it didn't feel like that empathy was always reciprocated. You know, I now look at the 2020 election cycle, and quite frankly, I think that some of the opinions that we saw maybe in 2016 or 2018 feel even more cemented in people's views than they did in 2016. And I say that in part because, you know, on both the left and the right, it feels like people are more animated. They're more angry than they were during that point in time. You know, I don't meet large numbers of undecided voters. People have, for the most part, made up their mind. And it has, you know, oftentimes, not always, but at times, fallen along racial or religious lines. And that poses a challenge, you know, to someone like me to go out and to be able to get different voter perspectives. And it has been a lot of hard work. It's not a job I would trade for anything. I mean, it is an incredible, valuable job, because I find that, you know, one of the great blessings that I have is I am able to speak to so many different kinds of people that ultimately I come back with a real good understanding, I think, of where we are as a country. And there are definitely deep divisions about how people feel, and you know, deep divisions about how they feel about a variety of things. You could argue about some of the racial changes in this country, about whether or not they think that, you know, science around the pandemic is valid or not. And these are problems that I would argue, regardless of who wins, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, will continue to be factors for the next president to figure out how to resolve. I mean, these are not problems that are going away anytime soon. And I think that they're part of our political conversation, and they'll likely continue to be a part of that conversation.
Our next guest is going to discuss the administration's first term by putting this American moment in context. We'll discuss democracy, the state of the office of the president, and our future. We're excited to be joined by Michael Beschloss. Michael is a presidential historian for NBC News and PBS NewsHour, a columnist for the New York Times, and the author of 9 books on the history of the presidency in America. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
I think this is an election of a kind that we have not seen before in American history. I know a lot of people oftentimes say that this is the most important election of our lifetime, but I think it really is. And if you had to go back in history for examples of other elections of this kind of importance where we were really at a crossroads, I would go back to 1860 when the country was deciding whether to elect Abraham Lincoln or not, but really deciding whether it would try to remain half slave or half free. And the result of that election was a civil war. Or 1940, a year in which Franklin Roosevelt was campaigning saying, I hope we can stay out of war against the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese, but I'm not sure that we can. And in order to try to stay out, I'm going to build 50,000 planes and try to beef up our defense. And his opponent, Wendell Willkie, was saying, elect Roosevelt, you'll be in a war almost immediately after Election Day. And some Republicans were saying, vote for Wilkie so that Roosevelt doesn't bring you a war that will, if you can believe it, this was actually said, that will plow under every fourth American boy. That was the decibel level. So what does that have in common with this year? I would say a number of things are at stake in a way that is way above partisanship. Number one, we've got a pandemic of a kind that we have not seen in 100 years. The duty of our government and our president is to keep us safe. They haven't managed to do it. So in voting this fall, we're casting a ballot that will have a lot to do with whether Americans live or die. Number two, we're in one of the most difficult economic situations of the last century. The two candidates for president and others at lower levels have different views on what we should do. Number three, look at this last summer. We now realize, I think many people more than they did before, how deep the problems of racial justice are in this country and how much they remain to be addressed. But above and beyond everything else, I think, is the question of democracy. And this is not a political comment. I'm not giving an opinion on healthcare or another political issue, but Donald Trump during the last 4 years has had certain strengths, but one of them is not a deep understanding or reverence for democracy. He's tried almost consistently to expand the power of the presidency, to break down the power of Congress, to some extent subdue the Supreme Court, and also subdue other institutions that are checks on the power of a president and government, like the media. So as rarely before in American history, those questions are at stake this fall as well. We've seen a big growth in presidential power over the last 4 years. And I've studied the presidency all of my life, and I have always been worried about presidents getting too powerful, getting us involved in unnecessary wars, sometimes not telling the American people the truth, and also in some cases posing a danger to our liberties. And one thing, whether you like Donald Trump or don't like Donald Trump, you would have to say about the last 4 years, this is a president who has been very serious about trying to expand presidential power as much as possible. When he says, I've given powers under the Constitution that are so enormous that I don't even talk about them, that's the kind of language that we've never seen from a president before in American history. I hope this is not a danger. I hope our democracy is permanent, but remember what the founders in Philadelphia embraced, which was the idea eternal vigilance is always the price of liberty. The great men and women who were in Philadelphia in 1787 knew that they could write a constitution. They hoped that ours would always be a government of laws and not of men, we would now say of human beings. But they also knew that they were writing a constitution that gave an enormous amount of power to those who serve as president, those who serve in Congress, and in other roles. It depends very much on making sure that you've got people in those jobs who do the right thing. And we've heard a lot the last 4 years about democratic norms, which I think is a little bit of too much of a social science term. All it really means is customs that we've all abided by as a way of showing our respect for democracy. And one of those customs has been that presidents have generally avoided letting the White House get too partisan. So when we see signs that a custom like that is abandoned, it makes me nervous for democracy. It makes me want to sleep sometimes with one eye open, because this summer we saw a situation where a Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, gave a political speech at a party convention. Virtually he did it because of the pandemic. That's something that we do not normally see. We saw a president give an extremely partisan address to a meeting of the Republican National Convention on the White House lawn. We've never seen anything like that before either. There's nothing against the law about it, but it does suggest a president who is very willing to shatter certain democratic traditions. So all I'm saying is that when you see, for instance, President Trump, as he did after his illness, and I think all of us are glad that he's feeling better, but give a speech from the rear balcony of the White House that is partisan to a political group that was, in this case, brought in to resemble a Trump rally at an airport, that's something that other presidents have not done because they felt that the White House should be a symbol of all of us and above politics. So if you are someone who is nervous about the future of democracy, pay attention to these little signs and make sure that they do not pass you by. We've got a wonderful Constitution drafted in Philadelphia, but in the end, it depends on human beings carrying out those democratic ideals. And one of the ways they do that is to show respect for democratic institutions. One of those institutions is the press. Every president hates the press. Every president thinks that people who are writing in newspapers or talking on television are saying things that are wrong and unfair and maybe even unpatriotic. But every president, including John Kennedy when he was angry at criticism over the Bay of Pigs, or George W. Bush when he was angry about what people were saying against the Iraq War, they all said that a free press is a basic element of a democratic society. Jefferson said, I would rather have a press without a government than a government without a press, because without that, you don't have a monitoring mechanism to make sure that the government does not take too many of our liberties. Anyone who has been unsettled by the last 4 years, some of the effort to freeze the press out, ignore the president's and the government's obligation to provide information to the public, should find that a little bit unnerving. All of us, I and all of us who are listening to the sound of my voice, we all have the most important role in American society, and that's the role of citizen. We vote, we get involved, and especially we watch very warily to make sure that none of our leaders tries to take too much power. And that has happened all through the history of the presidency. Presidents at times want to take on too much power. They get into fights with Congress. They take us into wars that are unnecessary. They do other things that our founders originally did not hope that they would do, because George Washington, for example, thought that the presidency would be a pretty modest office. But look at the last few years. We've seen a president who has used the Department of Justice in ways that we had not seen before, interfered with the idea of an independent Department of Justice. Anyone who was watching last summer, who saw Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., and some of the other things that happened at the time of the turbulence, you saw a president trying to use the military in a way that presidents have not done before to get involved in domestic affairs, to the point that we saw something that we haven't seen before, which is a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff going on television to apologize for having followed the president's orders to do things that, on reconsideration, he felt that no chairman of the Joint Chiefs should be doing. And this also goes for use of the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI and our intelligence agencies. I hope this does not mean that democracy is endangered, but it is always the duty of all of us citizens to watch all of this extremely carefully and make sure that democracy is not endangered. And the way we do that above all, of course, is to vote. I'm not an easily alarmed person, but I heard President Trump last summer talk about delaying the 2020 election. No president has ever remotely thought of doing such a thing. Not Lincoln during the Civil War, not Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. Roosevelt in 1944, actually some people said, we're in a world war for our survival. Maybe we should delay the election a year because we can't go through this at a time that we have so many Americans fighting all around the world. And Roosevelt said this is exactly the time that we should be doing this as normal, because we are setting an example for the rest of the world how a democracy operates in crisis. You've seen the president a couple of times saying, maybe I deserve a third term or a fourth term, and the usual constitutional restrictions should not apply to me. Later on, in most cases, he said, I was joking, but we're living in a very different time. In 1989, George H.W. Bush was inaugurated, and in his inaugural address, he said, the day of the dictator is over. That was true in 1989. That was the year that all those revolutions occurred in Europe, where authoritarian dictatorships backed by the Soviet Union came down. The Soviet Union itself was beginning to expire. We are now living in a very different world, and when you hear a president joking about things like that or saying that he's joking, take him seriously. Every president shatters historical norms. There is no rule book. What you hope to do is elect a president of the United States who has a sense of history and a love of democracy and an understanding of the fact that we give our presidents an extreme amount of power, especially in the nuclear age. In exchange for that, we citizens demand from that president that that power be used with restraint. I don't think we have had any precedent for the kind of lack of restraint we've seen in the last 4 years. I sometimes think, what might historians say about the 2020 election, however it turns out within the next month, we hope. And one thing there is it always depends on what happens to this country. I remember what Ronald Reagan said at the Republican convention in 1976. He was saying that he had participated in the burying of a time capsule that would be opened far into the future, and he was wondering what future generations would say of American democracy. And he said that there were basically two scenarios. One, they would know whether American democracy had survived or not. And number two, if our freedom had not survived, no one in the future would be allowed to know about that. And I hate to sound so draconian, but we have some of the same echoes as we approach the election of 2020. Where does democracy go from here? It depends on all of us. And anyone who loves American history, which includes me, and I'll bet includes all of you listening, you have to be an optimist. Look at all the things that we've gone through over the last 2 centuries and more, these crises, these wars, these economic calamities, even pandemics. Philadelphia used to close down and people would have to leave because there would be waves of yellow fever, as most of you know. Somehow we get through it, and there's something in the American DNA that allows us to surmount the crisis that we're in. So for anyone who's alarmed by what we're living through in 2020, I would say westward look, the land is bright.
I'm David Thornburg, President and CEO of the Committee of 70. The Committee of 70 was founded 116 years ago to, in part, make sure that in every election in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia, every voter and every vote counts. And we're kind of old-fashioned about this. We believe that democracy works better when more people come out to vote and they know what they're voting for. That's why I'm really excited to announce that pretty soon I'm going to be headed across Pennsylvania visiting all 67 county seats in my Volkswagen with a really special guest to make sure that we meet with voters wherever they are. We'll go to farms, we'll go to cities, we'll go to small towns. Everywhere we go, we're going to be meeting with voters and spreading the word about this coming election to make sure that they're prepared to vote. There's nothing more important in our democracy that voters come out and know exactly what's on the ballot, what's at stake. And here he is, my man, the voting fanatic. Boom! So I can't tell you how excited I am about this trip. We're going to visit Altoona, we're going to visit DuBois, we're going to go to Kensington, we'll go to Erie, Wilkes-Barre, Luzerne County, Bethlehem, Lehigh, Shamokin. We'll go to every corner of the state to make sure that voters come out and are reached by the Committee of 70's good work. Am I right? I am right. Okay, be on the lookout for us as we're driving across the Commonwealth. You won't miss the Volkswagen, and it says right on it what we're all about. We vote and make... Wait a minute. He's jumping the gun. He doesn't know where he's going. Volkswagen, I need a Volkswagen. Someone bring me a Volkswagen. Dave, but
my hero.
What's the deal? I can hear you yelling for a Volkswagen all the way from my office.
The fanatics
Whoa,
stole a
dude, what's the
Volkswagen.
deal with the uniform?
Well, put me in, coach, but wait.
It's a little snug, isn't it?
Go get the Volkswagen.
Let's get to the polls. Let's get them. Go.
Let's go.
Hey David, I heard you need a Volkswagen. My 1972 Karmann Ghia convertible is at home, and it's yours if you need it.
Please vote. If you have any questions, contact the Committee of 70.
Come on, Philadelphia. Come on, Pennsylvania. It's time to vote. V-O-T-E. Vote. We'll see you November 3rd.
The Republican Party must become much more socially tolerant. That is, in order to attract younger people into the party, it must speak to younger folks, on issues like, LGBT rights, even abortion rights. I'm not asking the party to take a position. I'm just saying, just to at least accept a diversity of views on some issues like that. The party's also going to have to come up with an agenda on climate change. Complaining about the Green New Deal is not enough. You have to come out with your own policy. So social tolerance, I think, is important. And again, in the era of Trump, when you have a president who makes racially and ethnically inflammatory and incendiary statements about various people of color, Muslims, and others, again, that shows that the party is not welcoming and, in fact, hostile in some cases. So the party, again, social tolerance is I'd say, the first pillar that I would embrace going forward. Another thing the party needs to do is become much more constructively engaged on the international scale. In the era of Trump, if Trumpism can be defined as like 3 or 4 isms: protectionism, isolationism, nativism, unilateralism, and maybe a touch of nihilism. I think, again, this has harmed the Republican Party, because it seems on the international stage we've said that we're going to go it alone, America alone, and that America, above all else, should look out for its own interests. But at the same time, I think we can make a very strong case that we can advance American national interests through multilateral organizations like NATO and others, or a Trans-Pacific Partnership, or there are a number of ways we can do this. And I think in the era of Trump, we've taken this go-it-alone approach, or America alone approach, that has isolated America in many respects. So we need to get back to a more traditional, conventional foreign policy where we embrace allies and build coalitions to advance our interests. And that's what separates America from, say, Russia or China, where we actually have allies, real allies all over the world. And those countries don't. So I think that's something I would make the second pillar: constructive engagement on the international stage. Third thing I would focus on would be a party that does embrace free markets. And what I mean by that, I'm not talking about returning to 1850 or the 1920s, but free markets with reasonable rules and regulations, as a contrast to Democrats, who tend to have more of a statist approach to many problems. It will immediately, turn to government for a solution for whatever the issue is. So those are the few things I would do to make the party more welcoming. Now, the question will be, after this election, and if President Trump were to lose, we'll see. We'll see which direction the party goes. I do fear that some will say after the election that, yeah, okay, if Trump loses, well, yeah, we knew he was kind of a little crazy. He was way out there. But what he stood for on a policy basis was where we should be, and that we should embrace this more. And I would argue that is not the right approach. I don't think a great nation like ours, is going to be successful if we, again, embrace those isms of isolationism, protectionism, nativism. That is not a way to grow a party or to make a country better.
Next up, I'm joined by Chuck Rosenberg. Throughout his career, Chuck has held numerous senior positions in the United States Department of Justice as the United States Attorney, the Chief Law Enforcement Office, a counselor to the Attorney General of the United States, Chief of Staff to the Deputy Attorney General, and as the Administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Tonight, we discuss where America goes from here and the role of the rule of law in today's society. Chuck, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Legally speaking, what most worries you about the night of November 3rd?
Every election in American history has ended with a concession, which is really pretty remarkable if you think about it. That the loser concedes the election, even though he, and so far it's always been he, could probably contest it in some way, in some state, in some manner. Even after Bush v. Gore, when Gore could have pushed the issue in other states, he accepted the decision of the Supreme Court, and that day conceded to President Bush. Those norms, right, the way we conduct ourselves between the lines of the rules are so important to governance in America and also to elections in America. And that's what worries me, a departure from norms, or I should say, a further departure from norms.
Do you worry about attempts to marginalize the Department of Justice if, in fact, there's not a concession on election night?
Well, I always worry about the Department of Justice because that's where I grew up professionally, and I love it, and I care deeply about it. And I've also watched over the last 3+ years what I think has happened to it. So, yes, I do worry about it being marginalized. I worry about it being politicized, and I worry about it not maintaining its reputation for fairness, at least the reputation I ascribe to it.
Where and for what do you believe that President Trump faces potential legal jeopardy should he lose this election and no longer be cloaked with the protection that he has today?
Well, the protection he has today, let's be clear, comes from policy, not from law. It's the policy of the Department of Justice, and that policy was issued both under President Nixon and President Clinton, that a sitting president can't be charged, can't be indicted while in office. That policy doesn't apply to any state. And so even though he doesn't face jeopardy today from the Department of Justice, the federal Department of Justice, he does from any state in which he may have committed a crime. Look, this is a thing that I've thought about a lot, Michael, and I don't really know what to think. Let me explain that, because that I know that sounds a little bit muddled. Nobody is above the law, including the president. But I would hate to have in America, this notion of a truth commission, that the incoming administration, whatever party, goes after the outgoing administration, whatever party. I believe President Trump committed crimes while in office. That's predicated in large part of the findings of the Mueller team, particularly volume 2 of their work on obstruction of justice. And so as a rule of law person, as a former federal prosecutor, I hate the notion that somebody might escape justice, not be prosecuted for what I see as prosecutable crimes. On the other hand, I don't like the idea that we seek political revenge and that we try and go after, Trump just because he's a former president, and we can. The story here, the illustrative story, is Ford's pardon of Nixon. I thought it was an extraordinary act of grace. I thought it was completely appropriate. He was excoriated for doing so. The reason he did it, Michael, is because he said we need to look forward and not backward. And interestingly, a quarter of a century after Ford issued that pardon, Senator Ted Kennedy, who was one of those excoriating Ford for pardoning Nixon, presented to an elderly Gerald Ford in the summer of 2001 the John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award. He said that Ford had it right and he, Kennedy, had it wrong. And as a nation, we needed to look forward and not backward.
I think the words were, "Our long national nightmare is over." I may be mistaken. And I'm so glad that you raised this historical example from the 1970s. That, of course, could protect if, and all hypothetical, we've all seen the polls, but I should say for the two of us, we have no idea how this is about to unfold, nor who will win. But if it should be an incoming Joe Biden as president of the United States, theoretically, when he's president, he could pardon Donald Trump to the extent that Trump needed any pardonability. But he couldn't do it for state crimes, right? I mean, he couldn't protect against whatever might come out of a New York State investigation.
That's exactly right. The pardon power of a president is for federal crimes only. And he could not pardon Mr. Trump, for instance, for any crimes that violate New York State law.
Okay, how about this, Chuck? Could the president assuming he were to lose the election, pardon himself on the way out the door?
Great question. Never been litigated. I mean, I could declare, Michael, that I'm going to be the starting center fielder for the Washington Nationals next season.
Right.
Doesn't make it true. It doesn't have any effect. I mean, could the president pardon himself? Yes. Is it legal? Is it lawful? Is it legitimate? Would it be upheld? I don't know. I don't think so, because it doesn't sound right to me. But we've never litigated it because no president has ever done it.
With regard to President Trump, is his longest lasting legacy, apart from the personal attributes and the pluses and minuses of the way in which he's communicated and so forth, but when you examine his record, is his longest lasting legacy the way in which he's populated the federal bench with young, conservative idealistics?
Well, in a sense, yes, sure, because that will outlive him. It will outlive his presidency, and it will very likely outlive him as well. These young men and women, some of whom I know, some of whom I like, some of whom are friends, some of whom are former colleagues, and some of whom are well qualified, might be around for the next 3, 4, or 5 decades. And so, yes, absolutely, Michael, that legacy will long outlive this president.
There's been a great deal of conversation in the last several weeks, if not months, about the 25th Amendment. Does the 25th Amendment work? Does it need to be rewritten for any particular purpose?
You know, it worked for President Bush when he had a colonoscopy. In theory, at least in written word, it seems adequate to the task. This president has sort of broken so many norms that it's hard to know how things will sort of hold up under the stresses of a Trump presidency. So on paper and by practice, the 25th Amendment seems adequate to the task. Whether or not it would be sufficient to President Trump, who knows? Because, you know, one aspect of the 25th Amendment is that if a majority of his cabinet finds that he's not able to fulfill the duties of the president, they could temporarily and perhaps permanently strip him of his power. But how realistic is that? How likely is that to happen? Who would dare do that, particularly to this president who's so vindictive? And so it's hard to know whether it's adequate to the task.
Right. One component of it, you correct me if I'm wrong, but one component of it says if I'm going in for a colonoscopy and I'm going under anesthesia, then I'm going to temporarily transfer power. A different provision of it, as you were making reference to, demands that you've got the cabinet and the vice president on board to say whomever the number one is, for whatever reason right now, is not able to perform their responsibilities. It's really the second of those provisions that I was wondering, is there something else that needs to be explored?
Yeah, I agree with you. The first one seems adequate. The second one seems inadequate. It seems like it was put there as not as a filler, because I don't think that's fair, but as a catch-all, right? In other words, we can't think of every situation in which the president may be disabled, so we'll create this other category where the cabinet and the vice president can act to strip an unable president or a disabled president and take away his powers, at least temporarily. But it's not well defined. We don't know under what circumstances it would be invoked or whether a cabinet would have the political will to do it. Does it seem okay in writing? It seems okay in writing. It just seems quite distressed in practice.
The nomination of Amy Coney Barrett has put back in play discussion of things like court packing and the filibuster. Will you comment on the likelihood of each of those, meaning the expansion of the federal court, the return of the filibuster?
Sure. So I am anti-court packing, and decidedly so. I understand the impetus, I understand the frustration, I understand the anger among Democrats when a highly qualified judge, Merrick Garland, didn't even get a hearing. I get that. The history of court packing is really quite fascinating. So the Supreme Court is established by the Constitution of the United States. Lifetime tenure of federal judges and justices is established by the Constitution of the United States. The number of justices is not established by the Constitution, it's established by statute. The Judiciary Act of 1789, Michael, set that number at 6 for the Supreme Court. And the number went up and down, fluctuating between 5 and 10 until 1869. In the Judiciary Act of 1869, signed by President Grant, It was finally set at 9, and it's been 9 for 151 years since. 9 is not a magic number. It's just the number we happen to have. And again, not established by the Constitution, but by statute. That means it can be changed by statute. You know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously proposed changing it in 1937 because he was so upset with the Supreme Court striking down so much of his New Deal legislation. But I actually found a speech that President Taft gave in 1912 at Yale. He is the only person ever to serve as both President of the United States and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. There must have been something bugging him in 1912 because at Yale he talked about the evils of court packing. I can't figure out what was going on back then, but this is not the first time that it has been discussed publicly. Here's the problem. Because it is by statute, it can be changed by any other Congress. Anytime the Republicans control the House and Senate and the White House, they can up the number. And if the Democrats then take the House and Senate and White House back, they can up the number. There's no limiting principle. It's a one-way ratchet, I guess, as most ratchets are. And so we would then be making the Supreme Court, which I think should be an other in American life, apart from politics, like everything else in American life, that is to say political. I think it's an awful idea.
You wrote recently for the Washington Post that the Justice Department must be fair and perceived as fair. Why were you differentiating the two? What were you saying?
Right. So our outcomes have to be fair. They have to actually be fair. We have to treat defendants fairly. We have to follow rules of evidence and procedure, right? Everybody is entitled to their due process, to the advice of counsel, to confront and cross-examine witnesses, to a impartial jury, right? To an impartial magistrate or judge. That's actually fair, and we have to be that. But we also have to appear to be fair. And let me give you an example. The president tweeted, for instance, and spoke often about the injustices that were befalling his friends, Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, and the like. And he asked the attorney general, and he asked the attorney general to fix this thing, right? He asked the attorney general to weigh in. He asked that they be treated differently than you or I would have been treated, Michael, if we found ourselves in that sort of difficulty. And the attorney general weighed in. And it looked like he weighed in because of what the president had asked. And that's deeply problematic. In the end, a judge sentences Roger Stone. And so the outcome could actually be fair. It could be objectively fair because a judge put all of that aside when she pronounced sentence. But it appears unfair because the president didn't weigh in for you and me. He didn't weigh in for anybody else. He weighed in for his political ally and friend, Roger Stone. And so unless we're both fair and appear to be fair, there's a problem. Because if we don't appear to be fair, right, we lose that sort of that moral fiber, if you will, that objectivity, the way people perceive us, the way they think about us, whether or not they find in our work, right, a degree of procedure and normalcy that they can trust. That's what the president has eroded. And that's why being fair in and of itself is not sufficient. We also have to appear fair.
And finally, at some point after this election concludes, John Durham's investigation into the origin of the Russian probe is going to conclude. What do you think he'll find?
So I think he'll probably find what everyone else has found, what the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence has found, what the Mueller team has found, what the Inspector General has found. Lots and lots of people have looked at what John Durham is doing, right? We know there was massive Russian interference in the 2016 election. We know that the FBI appropriately and properly opened up an investigation, a counterintelligence investigation into that interference. We know from the Inspector General that political bias did not infect the work of the FBI. I don't imagine that John Durham is going to find anything very different than that. I should say this. I know John from my years in the Department of Justice. I like John, I respect John, and I trust John. It's not John that worries me. It's what happens with his report. Case in point, Michael, I deeply respect Bob Mueller. I had the privilege of working for him on the FBI on his staff after 9/11. I read the Mueller report, all 448 pages. I thought they did a spectacular job with it. And then Bill Barr, when he received it ahead of public release, I think, completely distorted its findings. And the lies that Bill Barr told about the report, made it out of the gate long before the truth ever caught up. That's what I worry about. Not so much what John Durham finds, but how his political superiors might try to spin it.
A final thought on that, if I may, my own 2 cents. I too read the full report. I just think that Robert Mueller could have brought it to a different conclusion. He was refusing really to follow his own findings and say to the Congress, this is now what you have on your hands. I find that there was obstruction of justice.
I've heard that argument and I understand that argument, but can I tell you why I think I disagree with that argument?
Sure.
Yeah, we alluded to earlier Department of Justice policy that says you can't charge a sitting president. What I think the Mueller team thought is that if you can't charge a sitting president, then it wouldn't be fair to tell anybody else publicly that they ought to charge a sitting president or that you think he committed a crime. He's not able to defend himself against what you think. He's only able to defend himself in a court of law to charges that are levied against him in a proper way. And so if you can't charge him, you ought not say publicly that he ought to be charged.
Okay, but I'll just push back in this limited respect. It's a conversation I think they should have had at the outset of their work, because there was an expectation created that he was going to bring it to a conclusion one way or the other. Instead, he seemed to have served up a conclusion that there was obstruction without saying so. And why do I argue that Mueller did believe there was obstruction? Because if he didn't believe it, he would have told us so. After all, he did that on collusion. You get the final word, though.
No, look, I think you're making a very fair point. I mean, if you're going to criticize the Mueller report for anything, I think that's it, Michael. I understand why he did what he did. I respect it. Bob Mueller is a tremendously dignified man. And I'm guessing, it's an educated guess, but I'm still guessing that he thought it would be unfair to come out and say, we think he committed a crime. Here you go, House and Senate, impeach him. Here's the roadmap. If you read the report, it's pretty clear what he thinks. He just didn't say it, to your point, Michael.
Chuck, that was excellent. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
My next guest, Nikole Hannah-Jones, is an award-winning reporter covering racial injustice for the New York Times Magazine. She's also the creator of the 1619 Project. Earlier this year, she won the Pulitzer Prize for her essay, which traces the central role Black Americans have played in this country. We're going to discuss the call for a more just and equitable society happening in cities across America in the face of the upcoming presidential election.
What can be done to improve the state of race relations in America? That's a difficult question to answer in a few words. We know that we have a country that was founded on the genocide of Native people and the chattel slavery of Black Americans, and we are still dealing with the inequalities that these two systems created. I would argue, though, that one of the levers that would have the greatest impact in the shortest amount of time would be financial reparations, both to the descendants of Native Americans who had their land stolen and to the descendants of American slavery. Black Americans and Native people are on the bottom of every indicator of well-being in this country. The Black-white wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans has remained unchanged for the last 70 years. And in fact, it would take the average income of 11 Black Americans to equal the average income of a typical white household. So I think reparations is in the form of financial restitution to descendants is one of the greatest levers that we have, but it is also one of the least politically popular. I think public education is a linchpin of our democracy. And so there are many ways that a well-funded and functional system of public schools helps to lead to more equality and justice. First of all, public schools were founded to be the great equalizer, to say that it didn't matter where you live, it didn't matter if your parents had money or not, that we would all be able to get a basic quality education. But that this is also a place, one of the few places left in modern society where we mix across social classes, where children who come from wealthier households can be in the same classrooms and in the same facilities as children who come from lower households or lower income households. So in that way, this can be a great tool for equality. And certainly what we learn in those schools, if we are given a proper education that helps us truly understand our country, its history, and how we relate to each other, that is a tool for justice. Unfortunately, we've never actually lived up to the ideals of public education, and instead we have a vastly separate and unequal system of public schools. But at their highest potential, they're the great democratizers of our society. If the federal government were to invest more to make college access easier, particularly for students of color and for low-income students, that would certainly help make us a more just and equal society. We know that many lower-income students either have to defer college or not go to the colleges that they would want to because they can't afford them, and that Black Americans in particular borrow the highest amounts of student loans in order to attend college. They graduate with the highest amounts of student loan debt and yet make lower income, lower salary than their white peers. So if we saw more investment in schools and in the ability to pay for college, that would certainly help create a more equal and just society. But that's just one tool in the arsenal of what we'll need to actually have a more equal America. Class and race in this country are certainly related, but distinct. So when you understand that slavery and the 100 years of racial apartheid that followed slavery were at their heart institutions of economic exploitation. Black people were brought here in order to be enslaved so that their labor would benefit white Americans, and racism came about to justify that enslavement. And of course, once slavery ended, that was followed by another system of economic exploitation that we kind of benignly call Jim Crow. Then it makes sense why Black Americans today remain on the bottom in terms of wealth and income in this country. So yes, Black people are disproportionately poor, and that is largely because of our history of racial inequality. But race has its own distinct effect. So Black people who are poor actually live in worse conditions than white Americans who are poor. They live in more segregated neighborhoods. They live in neighborhoods with higher concentrations of poverty. And actually, a white person who has a lower income has higher wealth than a Black American who has a middle income. So we should think about race and class as intersecting, but also that race and class are distinct. And policies that are universal, such as universal health care or a universal basic income, those policies will certainly help all poor Americans, but they will still leave intact racial inequality because you have to address both class and race if you want to have equality in this country. I absolutely think that reparations for the descendants of American slavery is both, in terms of policy, the moral and ethical thing to do, but also that financially, for the health of our country, it is the right thing to do. It is not good for our country to have 13% of the population that is held artificially without wealth. And this wealth, this lack of wealth in Black communities means it is harder for Black Americans to send their children to college. It is harder for Black Americans to start their own business. It is harder for Black Americans to be able to purchase homes. All of the avenues to the middle class, because of our history of anti-Blackness and slavery, Black Americans have a much harder time doing that. So if we wanted a policy that could address so much of the racial disparities in this country kind of in one fell swoop, what reparations would be that policy. So I do think that just in terms of restitution for the crimes against humanity that slavery constituted, but also as kind of sound fiscal policy for a more equal America, reparations is some policy that we should be pursuing. I think when I look at the outcomes of the Black Lives Matter protests this year, I tend to look at them through the lens of history and understand that social movements do not bring about transformation immediately. That if you look at the abolitionist movement, if you look at the civil rights movement, these were decades-long movements. And Black Lives Matter is going to likely also be a decades-long movement before we see the type of massive and transformational change that it requires. So no, we haven't seen major legislation being passed. We haven't seen major accountability measures being passed to kind of hold police accountable. We haven't seen changes in police funding. We haven't seen changes in how often we're incarcerating American citizens. But I think we also have to understand that these movements are movements that are going to take a lot of time. And I think what is encouraging is that people are not giving up. The protests are continuing to happen. The conversations are continuing to happen. And we're going to have to continue to see pressure being applied.
For my friends at the Committee of 70, there is so much still about to happen that we could never imagine. In just the past few weeks, we've had not only the continued pandemic, but also civil unrest in various American cities, reports of the president disparaging the war dead, the emergence of a recording of the president underplaying the threat of COVID-19, a sudden death leading to a Supreme Court vacancy filled in the 11th hour of the campaign, a report that the self-described billionaire didn't pay federal income taxes for more than a decade and personally guaranteed more than $400 million in loans that will come due during his second term, if there is one, and a president diagnosed with COVID-19. If presidential politics were a sport, it'd be a football, because you just don't know which way things are about to bounce. Intangibles are always a part of a presidential election. Think about it. Who could have predicted that in 1960, Richard Nixon's debate performance would be remembered more for his lack of makeup than his words? That in 1967, George Romney would see his candidacy implode after saying he was brainwashed while in Vietnam? That Edmund Muskie would either cry or get snow in his eye in New Hampshire in 1972? That in 1976, Gerald Ford would say there is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe in a debate against Jimmy Carter? Or that in 1987, when Gary Hart told the media if they followed him, they'd be bored, they would, and they weren't. That in 1992, Ross Perot would drop out of the race after saying that the Bush campaign was plotting to disrupt his daughter's wedding. That the 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush would come down to something called hanging chads. That in 2004, worse than Howard Dean's third-place finish in the Iowa caucus would be the scream with which he ended his concession speech. That in 2015, Rick Perry would say if elected, he'd eliminate 3 government agencies and then not be able to name one of them. Or that in 2016, this amazing trifecta would play out over one weekend. It began on Friday, October 7. That afternoon at 3:30, the intel community told the media that Russia was meddling in our election. But that stunning revelation would soon be a footnote, because a half hour later at 4:03 p.m., the Washington Post revealed that in 2005, Donald Trump had made crude comments about women while being interviewed by Billy Bush for Access Hollywood. People like me thought that would finish his campaign. Except almost immediately after the Access Hollywood tape was published, WikiLeaks released a trove of 2,050 emails from within the Clinton campaign. Just after midnight, Trump hastily released a video apologizing for his past behavior. He called it locker room talk. The following day, Saturday, October 8, Trump gathered his leadership at Trump Tower. Speaker Paul Ryan had disinvited Trump to a rally in Wisconsin. RNC Chair Reince Priebus told Trump that his choice was either drop out or lose in a landslide. Calls were mounting among Republicans for Mike Pence to replace Donald Trump at the top of the ticket. All of this caused Donald Trump to quip, "What's the good news?" Then came Sunday, October 9, the second debate between Trump and Clinton at Washington University in St. Louis. And Donald Trump pulled off a surprise. Less than 2 hours before his debate, he held an impromptu press conference presenting 3 women who each accused Bill Clinton of sexually harassing them, and 1 woman whose rapist had been represented by Hillary Clinton. When the Trump campaign then attempted to have the women sit in the family section of the debate as a means of intimidating Clinton, access was denied. You can't make this stuff up. It's all a great example of the twists and turns that determine the outcome of presidential elections, the sort of things we could never foresee. Which brings me to this Committee of 70. Here's the only certainty, the only thing we know for sure about the conclusion of the 2020 election. That we really don't know what's about to happen, unless you're this guy. Thank you. Don't forget to vote. Good night.